Well, my name is John Merrill, and I retired about 4 years ago from the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the State Department. And for 30 years before that, I followed inter-Korean relations and Japan as chief of the Northeast Asia Division. My background is as an academic, and during my time at the State Department, I also taught occasionally part-time. My master's dissertation was on the Sasam Sakon, and my PhD was on how the Korean War started. Wow, that's a long one. I'll take it apart into separate questions and try to answer each one. So you keep track and tell me if I forgot anything. The most important thing in any negotiation is to establish a degree of rapport with the opposite party that you're talking with. Unfortunately, the U.S. has had kind of an excessive amount of swagger during the Cold War period. And we're not used to talking as equals to other countries. So I give President Trump enormous credit, although I was worried at the beginning what he might do. He fell back on his experience as a businessman. And he's trying to make a deal, get to know the other guy. And we have an expression in New York, it's called schmoozing. It's talking someone up, and you could see that at the summit where they were patting each other on the back and shaking hands and smiling and doing that sort of things. That's a very different style than lecturing someone and calling them a bad guy. That is not going to work with North Korea, because they think that we're the bad guy. Now, second point, I think we have to look at how the nuclear issue started. During the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s, we had a policy called the New Look. It was a policy to shift over from conventional forces to tactical nuclear forces. And we did that worldwide, including in Korea. At one time, the United States had deployed in South Korea 950 tactical nuclear weapons. You can go on the internet and you can check this, but it's true. So you could argue that in a way, we started it. And so you don't have to explain North Korea's bad behavior with reference to their evil or bad nature. Maybe there's some of that, but another possible explanation is that maybe they behaved as they did because someone sensitized them to the value of nuclear weapons. And it may be more of an action-reaction dynamic. We took an action, they responded. Now, it's true that we removed all our nuclear weapons from South Korea during the presidency of Papa Bush, the elder Bush. But still, when we do these exercises, we, up until now, have employed nuclear-capable forces. So the message is very unclear to North Korea. If we want denuclearization, why are we intimidating them with forces that are nuclear capable? So anyway, Trump is a very smart guy. I agree with him on what he's doing with North Korea. Not necessarily in a lot of other things, but with respect to North Korea, he's exactly right. And up to now, no one else has got it. The Obama administration had a policy of strategic patience, which was kind of an ostrich with its head buried in the sand policy. as North Korea continued to make more and more nuclear warheads, we were doing nothing. We were shunning them. We were avoiding them because they were bad guys. That was not effective. And to his great credit, Trump recognized that, and now he's trying to resolve the problem. And he's making some headway. So I'm optimistic. I'm cautiously optimistic, because we're just at the start of what is going to be a long process. One more thing. It's going to be impossible to wait, for a whole variety of reasons, to the very end of denuclearization to start being nice to North Korea on more things. I particularly dislike sanctions. I think sanctions, as they've been employed, the only thing good I can say about sanctions is that if it comes down to a choice between sanctions or going to war, then yeah, I like sanctions. But people forget how World War II started, the Pacific War. The United States had an embargo, a kind of sanctions, on Japan, on oil and metal exports to Japan. And they decided that they couldn't take this too much longer. And so sanctions, as they increase the pressure on someone, you create an indeterminate situation. In other words, you don't know what the reaction is going to be. If you remember your psychology classes in college, it's a fight or flight reaction. Either the other side will come at you and fight, or they will cave in and surrender. We don't know, if we increase the pressure too much on North Korea, what they're going to do. So I think now is the time to think seriously about easing some sanctions, particularly those that are not, don't involve problematic North Korean activities. If they want to buy things to develop their economy and these things don't have a military purpose, fine, let them have it. You know, in the 19th century, maybe it sounds naive now, but there was a feeling that countries that trade with each other don't fight with each other. So I like that concept. We should encourage North Korea, and we shouldn't be too slow in easing sanctions. Now, I remember the Banco Delta Asia sanctions and the terrible time that Ambassador Chris Hill had once we decided to lift those sanctions, to actually do that. The only way we could do it was to move money, North Korean money that had been seized, through shady Russian banks. Nobody else would touch it because of sanctions. So sanctions can be counterproductive. They're not an answer to everything. Although, maybe you have the same problem here in South Korea. In the United States, we have a problem called bureaucratic politics. Each agency wants to self-aggrandize. And so Treasury really advertises sanctions. They say they're great because they're in charge. We've reached the limit, I think, of the usefulness of sanctions. And it's time, on a selective basis, as dialogue proceeds, to ease up a little bit. And this would be good for everyone. There are a lot of South Korean businessmen that have projects with North Korea in mind. There has long been discussion of big infrastructure development projects, railways, pipelines, things of this sort. And I think it's time for Korea to transition, both North and South, but looking at it from a South Korean perspective, from being, we used to say, the frontier of freedom, to being the meeting place, the nexus, the growth node of Northeast Asia. So that's my hope. Well, I agree with you. I think they should be in a supporting role. And I think the main parties are North and South Korea, and to a somewhat lesser extent, the United States. But that threesome is the main geometry going forward. But in addition, there can be other countries involved. Now, there was one country that you didn't mention, which is very important, which is going to have to be involved, and that's Japan. Now, have you got that in another question? Recently, Prime Minister Abe has softened his position on the nuclear issue, and he's saying now that he's even prepared to have a meeting with Kim Jong-un if it will help settle the abductee issue. So I think this is great, and I think China's played a very constructive role in this as well. So far, we haven't seen too much from Russia, but at least they're not stymieing anything or creating obstacles. So, yeah, I think what we're trying now is top-down diplomacy, whereas before we tried to work it through the bureaucracy. It took forever. Unfortunately, it didn't produce any results. But now you have the top guys engaged, and things can move a lot faster. So I would say all three leaders, President Moon, Chairman Kim, and even President Trump, deserve a lot of credit. And I think this would not have been possible. I don't want to talk about Korean domestic politics too much, but it would not have been possible if you did not have a progressive government in Seoul. Maybe President Park Geun-hye at various points had an enlightened policy, but then she stumbled in her Dresden speech, and it went downhill from there. So I think that's the basic dynamic, a top-down process with the leaders face-to-face negotiating these things, and so far it's produced some good results. And it looks like more is to come. We're going to have family reunions. We're going to have remains returns of soldiers killed during the Korean War, and probably a lot of other good things. So let's keep our fingers crossed. It's still very early, but I'm mildly optimistic. Well, as I said, I'm very positive. Maybe some of my fellow analysts and pundits in DC agree with my point of view, but I think we're in a minority. But you know, one of the problems with pundits, and I'd urge Jeju Forum to do this, is, and the media, is that the media never keeps track of what people predict. I think I have a pretty good track record. I think some of my friends who share similar views have a pretty good track record. But there are lots of people, if you remember, just 6 or 7 years ago, who were, I won't mention names because I don't want to make enemies, who were predicting the imminent demise of North Korea. So it's not a matter of voting. You have to do the analysis, you have to look at it deeply and seriously, and then you have to present your conclusions. Oftentimes in Washington, there's a follow the herd mentality. People just repeat what is in the air, and they have not done sufficient analysis. You have to do that. You have to do your own analysis, and you have to keep track of how well you're doing, what your batting average is. There's some people on the North Korean issue who probably have a batting average of under 100. You know, it's not very good. So that's what I would say. I don't care what the majority opinion is. You know, I learned this in INR when I was working there. One of the big issues that came up, I wasn't directly involved, but I knew all the people in my organization who were, was the Iraq WMD issue. And so there was kind of a groupthink. And President Bush, the younger Bush, thought that Saddam Hussein had a nuclear program. And most of the intelligence community was stampeded into supporting that view. There was a national intelligence estimate written, and there were 2 dissents. If you don't agree with a conclusion in one of these estimates, you can say, I don't agree for this reason. So INR and Department of Energy. You'd think Department of Energy, who makes nuclear weapons, would know something about them. But we were stampeded. And even our own Secretary of State, Colin Powell, went with the majority opinion. So people talk about intelligence failures. There are those things. But more often than not, it's a policy failure. And it's due to groupthink and failing to do the analysis properly. One of the things that drives me nuts is that a lot of people have what I would call an essentialist view of the world. Not just of North Korea, but of the world in general. There are good guys and there are bad guys. That isn't how I approach things, and I don't think that's the proper way to approach things. You have to approach a problem like the North Korean nuclear problem, as I indicated earlier, against a timeline and see how the problem developed, how it unfolded over time. And if you do that, it's not clear that North Korea is the bad guy. I just told you why. Now, I don't like what they're doing, although recently they've had a change. But if you take a moralistic, black and white, kind of cartoonish view of the world, and Kim Jong-un is the arch villain, and Donald Trump is the hero, or Hillary Clinton, or whoever it might be, you're not going to get very far making predictions. So that's what I would say. But I will say this. Looking at it along a timeline, Chairman Kim has had significant successes. You can go back and check the Korean newspapers and see how many people were predicting that he would never make it. Probably the majority opinion. So he survived. That's achievement number 1. Achievement number 2 is that he's managed to stabilize the North Korean economy. And you can check the numbers, but even the South Korean Ministry of Unification, I believe, estimates that they're growing at about 4% a year. That's remarkable. Even with the sanctions, he's been able to do that. So clearly he's doing something different. You can look at the way he behaves towards women. He brings his wife along. He doesn't have a comfort troop that he entertains himself with, like his father. I don't want to badmouth anyone, but he seems to be a family guy. Okay, he seems to be a normal person, and he's seen the outside world because he lived in Switzerland for, I don't know what the number was, maybe 5 or 6 years, his formative years. The world's, I would argue, most advanced economy. They don't have a lot of heavy industry, but they have everything high-tech. Drugs, information sciences. And it's also a very tough country. Somewhat like North Korea. It's mountainous. They were the only European country that was able to stand up to Hitler during the Second World War, because he knew that to attack Switzerland would be enormously costly for Germany. It just happens that there are very good air connections between Washington, D.C. and 2 Swiss cities. So it's a nice place to take vacations, particularly if you like mountains and you like lakes and you like trains, things that guys like, and maybe that a young Kim Jong-un would like. And I still remember going to the railway station with my wife one day, and the train was full of young reserve soldiers in their camouflage uniforms, and they had a SIG assault rifle, that's a Swiss manufacturer of military equipment, on one shoulder, and they had their arm around their girlfriend, and they were pulling a Swiss Army rollerboard. And so that has to make an impression. In the old days, they used to have ammunition, even at home, for those weapons. But too many people were being killed and too many suicides, so they started storing the ammunition in a local police station. But so he saw all this, and he knows that there's a different way and a better way. And it looks like he's trying to move in that direction. I wish him well, if that's what he's trying to do. Well, I think a multilateral security regime has to grow up organically through solving problems. I don't think a multilateral security regime is necessarily the way to solve those problems. We just talked about how it's summit-level diplomacy and the three main leaders and a couple of others. But sure, I mean, North Korea is not going to be happy just getting rid of their nuclear weapons if U.S. Navy ships, for example, can prowl the seas around Korea armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. Of course, we'll never say that they're armed with nuclear weapons because they have to make port calls in Japan, and Japan has a nuclear aversion. So, yeah, I think that's a natural outgrowth of the first stage, which is, as I said previously, this summit diplomacy, and gradually expanding to include others and to be put on a more institutional and more permanent basis. So that would be very good. Yeah, well, I have nothing against China's Belt and Road strategy, and I have nothing against Indo-Pacific strategy. I would make one remark about it, however. It's pretty obvious that it's pointed against the PRC. And I guess the feeling was that there wasn't enough weight behind existing U.S. alliance system, so-called hub and spoke architecture, to contain China. So we had to look for reinforcements, so bring in India. I don't think they're necessarily contradictory, but I like the fact that the Chinese approach has a lot of economics involved, and they would be one of the big beneficiaries of a settlement on the peninsula, because you could have rail lines coming from Europe through China down to Busan, to Japan, by ferry. And I don't see China as an enemy necessarily of the United States. They're, as we're seeing in these trade disputes right now, they're benefiting enormously from an Asian system in which the U.S. provides stability. So I don't think it's in China's interest, and certainly not in our interest, to upset the apple cart, so to speak. So let's see where the two concepts go. Free and open, sure, I can't object to that. Belt and Road, wonderful. I can't object to that either. I don't know where they rub up against each other and create a friction point. I'm not the one to tell. I would never presume to tell folks here how to do it. The Jeju. I think it's fine the way it is. I think one thing you have to do is what you're doing with this interview, is you have to, or you should publicize the forum a little bit more. So I assume this is going to be posted on YouTube. That's a wonderful way for you to advertise what's happening in Jeju. Hosting conferences. I mean, one of the things that was talked about as the summits got underway. Is it Jeju-do? Gee, that would make a nice venue for a get-together among the leaders. Maybe that will still happen. Who knows? But just keep plugging away. I think you're doing great as it is. And my old friend Chung In-moon, I guess, was one of the organizers of this originally. And I think it's developed into a pretty well-known event. Well, as you know, I did a lot of research on the April 3rd uprising. And I think people always have to remember the terrible things that can happen once violence starts to erupt. And I think a lot of critics of Trump's policy forget where we were just a year or so ago. We were on the brink of a war, possibly a nuclear war. And that's all been diffused right now. And I think it's an accomplishment. Now, Trump was criticized just the other day for keeping some sanctions on North Korea in the current climate. But that's the main thing I would say. Just be mindful that once something happens, it's going to be very difficult to control it, as we saw with the Sasam Sakon. And so we should all work to diffuse tensions, to bring about peace in Northeast Asia, in the Pacific region, and in the world. So congratulations on a wonderful endeavor with the Jeju Forum.